Hello, Mrs. F1.
Hello, Mr. F1. How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm good. For those of you, obviously, who are just listening to our podcast, you can't see us, but this is, in fact, our first ever video podcast we're putting up. And that's because Matt and I are in separate places, actually separate states. Matt, you want to tell the people why that is?
Yeah, I got a job in Boston, so I packed up and moved this week from Pittsburgh. And now we're 700 miles away from each other.
It's so crazy. You're so far away.
I know.
It's so, yeah, Matt, I will be joining Matt shortly in a couple of months. But yeah, like Matt said, he's got an amazing job and it required him to be in Boston ASAP. So I'm over here packing up our entire home and Matt's living in his one bedroom
That's
apartment.
right. That's right.
Oh, it's so weird. We've been married 6 years. And it's so weird being apart. For those of you that don't know us, we actually started our relationship long distance. We were like that for what, 3 years?
Yeah,
Something
three
like that.
years.
Yeah. So it's like we're back to dating again, which is so weird. Welcome to the podcast. Today we are talking about the Singapore Grand Prix. I felt like we had a whole nother summer break. We haven't put out an episode in a couple weeks because of our busy lives, but also there's been no racing.
It was a long gap. I think the Russian Grand Prix was supposed to be in between, right? So once that got booted off the calendar, that's what gave us kind of a longer break.
Yes, the Russian GP was supposed to be last week, but obviously that had been canceled due to political reasons. So we had a longer break than anticipated, but honestly, I think it benefited the drivers. They were probably thankful for it because this race is demanding in every single way possible.
Yeah, well, definitely Alex was grateful for it because, he had surgery before the last race and Nick DeVries did an awesome job stepping in. But I think the longer break helped Alex able to, get it, just become healthy enough to race again, which was awesome to see him back. So,
Right. It was crazy to think. And they pointed it out during the race today. Like less than a week and a half, Alex Albon was on a ventilator at this moment. And now he's in a race car. Just think about that for a second.
yeah, these guys are freak athletes.
Right. He had an appendectomy and had complications with the anesthesia, which caused him, they had problems resuscitating him, which is just crazy. And Matt, you've had an appendectomy. You know what that recovery's like.
Yeah, it's not fun. I could not imagine driving. I mean, the physicality of driving an F1 car ever, but let alone a week and a half after you had your abdominal muscles poked through. That's wild.
Yeah, it is pretty crazy, but happy to see him back and also just amazed at the same time. Because when they do the appendectomy, they cut through your abdomen, your abs. So basically, like you, Matt, you know what that's like. You can't even, it's hard to sit up. So
Yeah,
I can't imagine using your core muscles right now to keep yourself stable in the car. Like, holy crap.
I know. Yeah, it is wild.
It's a crazy. But before we jump into the just all craziness of the Singapore Grand Prix this week, there was a couple of bits of news that came out during our little F1 hiatus. One being some driver news. Yuki Tsunoda has re-signed with AlphaTauri. I don't know. I was kind of surprised by this, Matt. I don't know how you felt about it.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised by it. He started the season well. He hasn't really been doing, as good as he was at the beginning. But I think at the end of the day, Red Bull is just, they don't have the glaring talent in the pipeline underneath to replace Yuki. So at the end of the day, I think it makes sense to keep him around, give him one more year. And if not, see if they can replace him with Liam Lawson or Isaac Hadjar or one of their junior drivers.
Yeah, I agree with you too. I think they've also invested a lot in him at this point when it comes to developing him as a driver. And I don't know, in my eyes, I thought for sure he was gone, especially how long it kind of took to get him signed. Because he hasn't been performing great this year. In the media, even like Helmut Marko hasn't been talking very positively about him. So I thought, okay, maybe this is it. and they're just going to take a chance on someone younger. But I think maybe this is kind of like the last chance for Yuki next year to prove himself. And if they don't see any improvement, I don't see him in that AlphaTauri seat for 2024.
No, I agree. I think, like I said, I think that the real reason is that they don't have a front runner in their junior driver development program to, replace him. But maybe by the end of next year, they have somebody kicking the door down, and if Yuki doesn't perform, I'm sure Helmut will be really quick to replace him with the nice new young thing that he
Helmut
likes
Marko
to. Yeah,
loves his shiny new objects.
exactly.
Speaking of possible empty seats, it has now been confirmed that our boy Gotifi is leaving Williams.
Tiffy's gone.
R.I.P. Gotifi and Williams. I mean, I wasn't surprised by this. I don't think anyone was surprised by it.
Nobody was surprised by it. The only reason I thought that he would stick around is because he has a lot of money. But I guess Williams was sick of not scoring points. So I think it's an obvious choice that they should have went for De Vries, but now it sounds like De Vries might sign with AlphaTauri if Pierre moves. So who knows what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks in these final F1 seats.
Yeah, I mean, De Vries's performance in that Williams in the last race definitely did not help Latifi's cause.
No.
But yeah, I don't think anyone was surprised by this. I wasn't, you weren't. Do you think, dare I ask this question, do you think anyone else dare pick up Nicholas Latifi for 2023?
No, God, no. Unless Haas is really in need of some money and they don't want to sign Mick, but even then, I just can't see teams thinking this guy's worth it, even though he brings the money to the table. He just has not performed ever in F1.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think we'll see Nicholas Latifi in an F1 car or even any car for that matter after the season. So yeah, not surprising, but he'll be leaving, which leaves a vacant seat, which seems to be the only vacant seat left in Formula One, I believe, for next year.
I think it all depends on how the rest of the cookies crumble, right? We know that if Pierre does leave AlphaTauri and goes to Alpine, then there's the AlphaTauri seat that's open, but the rumors are that Nick De Vries is in line for that. If that is the case, then that's the last seat that needs to be filled. And I guess we also have to talk about Mick, because it sounds like Haas is not too thrilled with him, and he might even have to fight just to keep his F1 dreams alive. But I think there really is 2 seats open if we're counting Mick, but I would be shocked if Haas doesn't re-sign him. And, from that point, it's like, all right, who is Williams going to grab for that last seat? Things are starting to look good for Logan Sargent, but there's also talk of Nico Hulkenberg coming back. So it'll be really interesting to see what these teams decide to do. The musical chairs of F1 seats, see how they get filled.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought Mick up, because yes, obviously, that seat is open at Williams. No one's really sure who's going to take it at the moment. There's lots of speculation around Haas, as you brought up. It sounds like, and I read a quote this week from Gunther Steiner actually saying, I don't know what's going on with Mick. His people aren't talking to us and we're not talking to him. So I don't understand what's happening. And this is kind of puzzling to me. Like, what is going on that Mick is so willing to almost be okay with not being in Formula One next year? It's weird. And then there's rumors that it's kind of between him and Nico Hulkenberg, which I think is weird too, because we know Nico and Magnussen do not get along together at all.
Right.
I think that would be really detrimental to the team morale and the vibe at the team to put 2 guys in those cars that frankly just don't like each other. Now, again, that was years ago when they were driving with each other. Maybe they're on better terms now that they're not competitors anymore, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on if they put Nico Hulkenberg in that seat at Haas?
That to me, I've heard that rumor flying around. I just don't see that happening. Like you said, the relationship between those 2 guys is not great. It's pretty well known. I mean, to me, what I think happened is that Mick was hopeful he was going to get that AlphaTauri seat, and then be able to bide his time and hopefully perform well enough to get the Red Bull seat once Checo is gone. But I think that AlphaTauri saw Nick De Vries perform well in that Williams, and they want him more. And that
Yeah.
puts Mick in a really tough spot. Almost like he was counting on a seat. Now that it's gone, Haas is like, well, you didn't really want to be with us in the first place, so maybe we should look outside.
Right, absolutely. And I forgot to mention, actually, there is an open seat still besides Haas and AlphaTauri, possibly, is Alpine. They still haven't found a driver to drive next to Esteban Ocon, but it's pretty much well known at this point that Nick De Vries will sign with AlphaTauri. It sounds like, actually, I've seen in like some reporters are saying the deal's actually already signed. It's done. And then Pierre Gasly will move to Alpine to pair with Esteban Ocon. And we've talked about this before, but Esteban's been pretty vocal about how he would like Mick to be his teammate. So yeah, interesting. There's still a couple of pieces left out there to be put into the puzzle for next year's season, but I was a little surprised by the Yuki news. So we'll kind of see where that leaves everybody. And I really hope I see Mick next year. I think that would be a shame. It was kind of funny because during the race today, George was stuck behind Mick for a period of time. And he was saying, this guy is racing like it's his last race ever, or like racing the car off the track. And I was like, yeah, because he's probably trying to prove why he deserves that seat right now.
He still
maybe
deserves to be an F1. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's very much racing for his career the rest of these races of this season. So it's interesting. Rumors are rumors, but I guess we'll see how it plays out in the next coming weeks. Any predictions you think you have about this?
I think it depends on what happens with those other seats. If, in my opinion, if, like what we were saying before, De Vries signs with AlphaTauri, Pierre moves over to Alpine. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that Haas decided to go with a different driver other than Mick. I would be shocked if, all of those things being the case, that Williams wouldn't try and sign Mick. Because I know they have Logan, they like him, but he still doesn't have enough super license points, and he needs to guarantee that he finishes, I think, 5th or higher in F2 in order to have enough super license points. And I think at that point, Williams might say, hey, this is the best available driver, which I do believe to be true. I like Logan, but I think he needs a bit more development in F2. That would be my guess if those things happen, but I think that Mick is going to end up staying at Haas, and Williams will, they'll figure something out, whether it's Nico, whether it's Logan, whether it's somebody else to fill that seat.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do too. And only time will tell what's going to happen with these remaining seats. So it's like the Hunger Games. Best of luck, all you competitors. Hope you get a seat next year. Let's talk about another big piece of news that came out over our little, I'm going to call it like mini fall break. That's what it felt like. It felt like a whole nother break. The 2023 calendar has officially been set in stone and released by the FIA. And this has set a lot of people on fire. There are a lot of races on this calendar for next year. They are packing them in. I believe 23 in total.
It's going to be the most ever, is it not? Yeah.
Yes. Normally in a season, we have 21 races. But obviously that number's been growing over the years with the huge popularity in the US growing and the demand for more races in the US or in and around the US. What are your thoughts on 23 races for next year?
It might be too much, especially with the logistics of moving the whole F1 carnival from country to country. I think it would make more sense if the organization of cities kind of made sense. They went from east to west or west to east or whatever to make it as little travel as possible. But at the end of the day, they're just they want to make the money. I understand it, and going to a place like Vegas and racing down the strip is a really good way to do that.
Yes, and we all know that race has been heavily anticipated on the announcement of when it would be, and that race will be actually the second to last race. But what kind of baffled my mind the most is that race is happening on November 18th, and then Abu Dhabi happens November 26th. Wow, we're going to go from Vegas to Abu Dhabi. That's a quick turnaround for those teams, and two very, well, I guess not very different climates, but they're two very different circuits, but it's just a matter of getting all the teams from point A to point B so quickly. I was actually quite surprised by that.
Yeah, and F1 has mastered that, and they have a really cool video on how they kind of move that whole carnival to each city. But that is a tall task. We do know that the Vegas race is a Saturday race, so they have an extra day to make it over to Abu Dhabi. But it is a tall order, and I remember, I think it was during maybe testing in Barcelona, because it was so quick after another event. Haas was like waiting on parts, and they didn't arrive in time. And I mean, teams have to worry about that when the turnaround times and the distance is so great. I'm sure they'll figure it out, and hopefully we have something like last year where those two races actually matter, and the points are down to the wire, like it was for Lewis and Max in 2021. But I mean, as of right now, Max is probably going to clinch next weekend, if not for sure the following one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was actually shocked that we weren't hearing more comments from the drivers about this, because I remember it being talked about in the beginning of the season when the head of F1 said, well, we would love as many races as possible. I think Sergio Perez said, like, I wouldn't race if there were 23 races, right? He said that, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I haven't heard a peep out of him since this came out. So I mean, obviously when rubber meets the road, some of these guys may be like, well, it's either that or I lose my job, which sounds ridiculous. And Sergio Perez is kind of in a great situation right now with Red Bull. But I think this is going to just really be interesting more on the side of the racing. We have more races, which means obviously more opportunities for guys to grab points. It could make the championship a little bit more interesting, a little bit more dicey. The adding of Las Vegas and like some new tracks we haven't been to before, again, can spice things up when it comes to the championship race and the constructors championship. But also I'm just really curious to see if the drivers, how they're physically going to feel about 23 races. Like, what they're doing right now is already a lot on their bodies. They already don't have a ton of time off as it is. When you factor in the summer break and the off time. So yeah, like I said, I'm kind of surprised I haven't heard more guys this week saying like, this is ridiculous. But
yeah,
hey.
it is too taxing, I think. And unfortunately, that's the case with a lot of sports, where I think they make their athletes play too many games, and it's all, again, for the money, which is understandable, but it will be tough on the drivers, and it already is tough for them to do 21 races. So it will be interesting if somebody like Checo actually stays by their word and says, hey, this is too much, I'm going to do something else.
Yeah, it will be interesting. I mean, I can't, as a fan, I'm excited for more racing, but also I can't lie. When I saw the calendar, I was like, oh my God, that's a lot, like for the drivers and for us.
Mm-hmm.
Selfishly, I was thinking that. But yeah, I mean, great announcements. I'm happy to see, the popularity of F1 growing and the need for more races. But we'll see if anybody has anything more to say about this as the weeks go on and maybe some questions are asked. So, let's get into the Singapore Grand Prix. I made a joke on my TikTok. I was like, dear F1 admins, if you need a caption for your post today, you can call it Sparks and Spray, a Singapore race story. It was interesting. I think this is probably the most spicy Singapore race we've had in a while, because we often don't have a lot of weather here.
Yeah, we haven't seen the race since pre-COVID, so it's good to see the street circuit again. It's a very beautiful track and beautiful city. But as soon leading up to the race, everyone saw the weather reports, and that's always bound to spice things up as well. Raining during qualifying and during the race, it made it. Well, I mean, I thought it made it more interesting, but when you kind of look at the results at the end of the race, it wasn't too shocking. What you'd expect to see in a rainy race, some random person, uh, scoring more points than expected. But it was a very interesting race, and you could tell the drivers, it's so tough on them. I mean, it's a tough circuit. There's no wiggle room. You make a mistake, you're in a wall, you're in a tire barrier. So it just requires so much focus.
Yeah, a lot of the drivers, and I was actually listening to another podcast with Mika Hakkinen talking about this track specifically and how it is one of the most mentally and physically demanding tracks you will ever drive on. The heat and the humidity in Singapore is something of legend.
Mm-hmm.
And you're already in a very hot running vehicle and a very hot race suit and a helmet, and you're trying to keep yourself cool. We saw drivers doing drastic things when it came to training, like putting exercise bikes in saunas and literally like riding their bike full force in a sauna. It's crazy what these guys do to get their bodies conditioned for this one race out of the whole season.
Yeah, this in Malaysia are the toughest. I mean, humidity's constantly at like 80% or more. And
Ugh.
of course it's unbelievably hot because it's almost on the equator. So it's so taxing for these guys. I think Lewis said one time he lost like 4 or 5 kilos in the race, just
Yeah.
probably sweating everything out.
Yeah, this race is known for like drivers actually to lose the most weight. And it's also one of, if not, I think the longest race on the calendar, which is even crazier.
Mm-hmm.
So you're
Mm-hmm.
in that car longer than normal just because the nature of the track is one of the longest tracks. It's also a slower track just because of the street circuit, the tight corners. And it was even slower because of the
Because the
wet.
rain.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that was a whole reason why the track was taking so long to dry out, was because of the climate there. It's humid. So the track, I think we only started to see a defined dry line on this track come halfway through,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of
Mm-hmm.
insane to think about. And we even saw in qualifying, they had similar conditions, not as bad as today. But they were having similar problems. Now, I think this spiced up things on the side when it came to tire strategy. What were your initial thoughts? Did you ever think they would go on to slicks at any point? Because the track was wet.
Yeah, especially in qualies, I really didn't think we were ever going to touch slicks. And it kind of reminded me of the race that you and I attended. So when we went to Canada, um, the qualifying was pretty much all in the wet. And I don't know if you remember, but George decided to put on slicks right at the end, and everybody in the grandstand lost their mind. I was expecting to see something like that, but they all went out at the beginning of Q3 on their slick tires, and they were able to get it done. But it was, yeah, it's just a recipe for disaster. And obviously in the race we had 6 DNFs, so that stuff tends to happen when you get a lot of rain.
Yeah. It was crazy. And I also thought like we'd never see slicks. But like you mentioned, George Russell, the brave soul that he is, well, he was already in last, first of all. So he was like, what do I have to lose? Throw them on there, guys. Let's do
Yep.
this. And it was rough going for him when he first came out on those. But after a while, the track started to dry up a little bit more. And then he was able to get some heat in them, and they
Mhm.
seemed to work really well. And that's when we saw people when the 400th safety car came out. Everybody went on slicks. It was like a mad dash. Mediums mostly everybody put on, but some
Mhm.
people put on softs.
And Max marched through the field on his softs, passing Seb on the last lap. But it
Mm.
is that call by George. It's so interesting because if you time it right, it can be fantastic, and you can gain, you could gain 20 seconds on a lap. The issue is that if you make that call too early, now you're sliding around losing time. And the second you start to gain time, everyone else sees that data too.
Right.
So now you've already lost all that time trying to get the tires up to temp. And as soon as your lap times look good, now everyone else is diving into the pits, and really you're not gaining anything. So it was a risky strategy by George, and I respect him for it. But I'm sure they knew the risks, and they knew, like, look, if this is too early, he's going to be slipping and sliding, and we're going to gain no advantage. And unfortunately for him, he finished either dead last or second to last. I don't remember, of all the people who finished.
Yeah, he finished last
Yeah.
actually but
Mhm.
that was 14th place. Before we go into like some more logistics, I just feel like we need to talk about some things up front because we had, well, first let's go into Max Verstappen's race this weekend. Really, he could clinch the championship this weekend. He would have had to win the race, and Charles Leclerc would have had to finish in ninth or lower. And I
Mhm.
felt like the opposite happened. In qualifying, he just got really unlucky. The team made a mistake in the calculations of the fuel he needed.
Mhm.
And on his last flying lap, had to pit and qualified eighth. Yikes.
Yeah. Yeah, they did not set him up well. It's a shame because I don't think he would have had pole, but he would have been close.
Mhm.
And Max starting from second instead of starting from eighth, that's a totally different monster.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we actually, for once, saw Max make a mistake at the start of the race. And I can't even remember the last time I've seen Max make a bad mistake, but his start was terrible. He got
Mhm.
anti-stall, got passed by 3 people before turn one.
Yeah, he was in 12th place before turn 2, I believe.
Hmm.
I remember I was watching, obviously we watched separately because we're not together. And I was like, my mouth was just like gaping open because I was like, oh my God, he's literally plummeting down the pack.
Hmm.
And as if his weekend couldn't get any worse, it literally got worse. But if there's one driver that can march himself through the pack and even this track you can pass on, but it is tricky. You really need to
Hmm.
be so careful about it. And you kind of have to be patient and wait. I thought, okay, yes, he's all the way down there. This could be really difficult, but if there's anybody that could do it, it's him.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but he just did not have a great race. He was stuck behind Fernando Alonso for a while. God bless that man. No offense to Max Verstappen's fans, but like I was like, yes, Alonso. Like if anyone's gonna hold him up, it's gonna be him. But unfortunately, he took himself out of contention by DNFing. But I mean, Max had I don't know. It was just kind of like an race for him. It wasn't, he got stuck in a lot of traffic, which didn't help.
Yeah.
The track conditions didn't help. Do you think what do you think about his race today?
Well, I think Singapore is a tough place to overtake anyway. That's why the last 2 races we saw a ton of people taking penalties because they knew, oh, this is an overtake heavy track. Nobody wanted to take penalties. The only person who did was George. That's because he qualified so poorly. Mercedes just figured, well, we'll do an engine replacement and we'll take the penalty.
Yeah.
Um, I think from the start, it would have been tough to expect Max to go eighth to first. I think he could have done it, but because Singapore is a tough track to overtake on, it was a tall task. And of course, that start just it ruined the plans. But still, on paper, you see that he qualified eighth and finished, I think, sixth. That might not look seventh. So he
Mm-hmm.
only gained 1 place from the start. But if you really watched his race, and especially those last 20 minutes, he was marching, and
Oh,
he passed Lewis. Um, at the very end, he passed Seb, who's the lion of Singapore. He had himself a good end of the race, but it was unfortunately undone by the poor qualifying and the bad start.
yeah. I think a lot of drivers were victim to the not just the track this weekend. Obviously, like we said, without the water on the track, it's incredibly demanding. You are getting so close to those barriers and walls, and one little misstep can be the end of your game. And with the water on the track, it just makes it even harder and harder. We saw guys just sliding around like on
Hmm.
ice skates, even on inter tires. It was crazy. But another driver I think that just didn't have a great race where it could have been better for him was Lewis Hamilton.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Being starting, third and finishing where he did eighth, that's rough. I understand, he it's a wet race, so it's tough, but he did it to himself by, going straight on. And I think he did it actually at a couple of corners, just coming in too hot on a wet track and, made a mistake, and he apologized to the team. But at the end of the day, we're seeing a more human Lewis Hamilton this year.
Yeah, I think that's such a great way to put it. A more human Lewis Hamilton. He finished in ninth, by the way, right behind Sebastian Vettel, in eighth. But yeah, he was making mistakes, and I think we're not used to seeing that. I think Lewis was just being a little bit more risky. We saw, especially toward the last 20 minutes of that race, when him, Seb, and Max were all battling for seventh place. He went on some of those wet lines. He took those chances and said, maybe I can, which at the end of the day didn't do him any good. He put his car into the barriers and had to have his wing completely, replaced, which just took up and ate up more time. It just wasn't a great day for him. And because he qualified third, which is his best qualifying this year, by the way, I was kind of hoping I would see him up there on the podium. But it just wasn't meant to be. I think he just was taking these chances that he shouldn't have been. Nobody else, everyone was staying off that wet line. Everyone knew, like, as soon as you get on it, it's game over.
I think at the end of the day, maybe Lewis's thought process is, I have zero shot at a championship. Like, that's out of reach. So why not just take these risks, right? Like, what is there to lose? He's in sixth place or something like that in drivers' championship. He's not going to do any damage. Why not try and jump some places and, see if you can nab a win or something like that. But obviously it backfired for him today.
Yeah. There are 6 people at DNF'd in this entire race, which helped a lot of people out, but it was due to a lot of what we were saying, like the just misjudging corners, braking a little too late, and your car locks up or just skids right over those water, those puddles. We had Yuki Tsunoda, Esteban Ocon, Alexander Albon, Fernando Alonso, Nicholas Latifi, and Guan Yu Zhou all DNFing. That's a lot of DNFs. And I think a team that took advantage of all of that this weekend was McLaren. What a great result for McLaren in this race, but not just McLaren, Daniel Ricciardo, like, thank the heavens. He's finished in the top 10.
I think he was more opportunistic than anything. It helped that both Alpines were out. But at the beginning of the week, everyone thought that this track heavily favored the Alpine and that they were going to increase their points gap, in the Constructors' Championship. And now I believe McLaren jumped them.
Yeah,
because both of their cars DNF'd, both of the Alpine cars DNF'd, and McLaren scored so well that it's just wild how that worked out. That McLaren was like, oh, here's another week of underperforming, but Lando drove incredibly.
Absolutely.
As he always does. He's a phenomenal driver. But like you said, it was good to see Danny Rick make his way into the top 5, right? Top 5.
Yeah. So actually, Lando finished 4th, Daniel finished 5th, and you are correct that McLaren jumped Alpine in the constructors standings. They are in 4th with 129 points, and Alpine is right behind them in 5th with 125. So it's still close, but that is a huge win in McLaren's books.
Swing. That's a huge swing. And we know that the prize money, there's significant difference in prize money between those two places. That would be huge for them, knowing in the future, hey, that one of the races that we shouldn't have won, we just got points at. That'll hopefully motivate them and make that midfield battle much more interesting as the year goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was just, I think, a good win for Daniel. I think we've been waiting all season for him to just have a win. And I think today was that win. Hopefully that just gives him more encouragement, helps just pump up the vibes on that side of the garage and send him out on a better note. But I was happy to see. And I know it wasn't strictly because of his performance today that he was in that spot, but I still was crying inside, happy tears.
You'll take any wins you can get. Sometimes it's better to be opportunistic than it is to be good. So hopefully that'll it'll feed into his confidence, and next week in Japan he'll build on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope so too. And like you said, just really unlucky luck for Alpine. Alonso was in a good starting place, Ocon not so much, but Alonso's engine just went poof, 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 poof.
Yep.
Smoke coming out the back, and that was just unlucky. It was actually his 350th race today.
I know.
Wow.
Hey, we call him the old dinosaur on this channel, so
the fast dinosaur.
That's right. But he's he's still an incredible driver for his age. It's wild to see. And had he not had that engine issue, I think he would have at least split the McLarens, maybe even finished ahead of them.
I
You
agree.
know, it's wild, and hopefully he can get a more reliable car, and we can see him up near the podium. I would love to see him on the podium this year. Outside of the big three, we haven't seen any team other than Lando stand on the
Mhm.
podium. It'd be nice to see an Alpine and Esteban or Fernando standing on the podium at just 1 point this year.
Yeah, that would be great. And Ocon was having a decent race too. He was kind of making his way up, but then just again, the water was an issue. He went right into the barriers, and because of that, then his race was over. So
Did he
unlucky for
crash
them.
into who crashed into Zhou Guan Yu? Was that Alex?
Oh, that was Nicholas Latifi.
It was Nick Latifi. Yeah.
And he admitted on his radio, again, we heard him. I didn't see him there.
Mm-hmm.
I watched the replay of that, and that ended Guan Yu Zhou's race, his first ever race in Singapore.
That's a
And
shame.
yeah, his whole family was there too, which I
Ugh,
felt so bad. Um,
that's tough.
yeah, but yeah, again, Nicholas Latifi, just another reason why he shouldn't be in the car. Like an excuse of I didn't see him multiple times in an entire
Mm-hmm.
year.
Yeah.
Like, are you even looking at this point?
Well,
Like,
you have to have that like heightened spatial awareness that all these drivers have, but it seems like Nick is kind of lagging behind in that skill, and that's why, yeah, we hear these things. I didn't see him, but at some point you have to expect when somebody's next to you, and
mhm,
he just doesn't have that. And it's a shame that it ended Joe's race because he was racing pretty well.
he was, yeah. So let's talk about Ferrari because there wasn't much talk about them really until the end of the race. They kind of were just happy where they were sitting. Charles Leclerc, unfortunately, just not a great start. Lots of tire spin. And I mean, there's not much you can do about that. When the track is wet, it is what it
Yeah.
is.
Yep.
His reaction time was actually faster than Sergio Perez's, but because of the tire spin, it kind of ruined his start, and Sergio just took advantage of that, went right in there. And then I thought he might even lose more spaces. There's a lot of calamity going on in the beginning. What did you think about the start today and
Yeah,
with the track?
I think it's a shame because the way that track is set up, if it's raining, it's actually much more beneficial to be in that second spot than it is to be in the first spot. Because Charles, yes, he's ahead of him, but he's got to cut across to the right in order to make that first left-hand turn. And as you saw, he had just the slightest wheel spin, and Checo's already in line to make that. He's already in the racing line. All he has to do is drive straight. I think, that's something they should maybe reconsider for that track, maybe giving that P1 spot a little bit more advantageous track positioning. But, Checo had a great start, no wheel spin. Looked fantastic. And I think, Charles just got beat. And again, it hurt being on the inside, but you have to give your respect to Checo for holding the lead after all the safety cars and restarts, and to be able to fend Charles off and then build up a big enough gap. I think it was one of Checo's best races.
Yeah, and Sainz got lucky too. Hamilton didn't have the best start. They actually hit each other into turn one, which
Mm-hmm.
caused Hamilton to go wide. No investigation needed for that, but Sainz held in there. He really held his place, and it's tricky to get off that line. You're running on a wet track, and also I think it's interesting because this is a street track. Cars are driving on this road specifically every day of the year. So there's already oil and some sort of rubber laid down on this track. So I think that's something important to remember. They were saying it a lot during the race, like, oh, this track is greasy. And that's because it's a road. It's a main
All
road
street
in
circuits,
Singapore.
exactly. Yeah, all street circuits have that issue, right? So,
That's why rain is so a little bit different when you're on these city circuits.
mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of a slippier element, I guess.
Yeah,
That's such a technical term I just used.
right. Well, hey, I think Checo has shown that he can race well on these street circuits. He's won in Monaco. or at least I think he's won in Monaco, or he's gotten
Yes,
close.
he won in Monaco this year.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He won in Monaco this year. He's won in Baku as well, street circuit. Now he's won in Singapore. He is very talented at these street circuits. I don't know what it is. He can kind of step up his focus. And like we said, the street circuits, they have no wiggle room. And, you miss a turn, you're going into a wall. And, that's why I have a ton of respect for Checo for putting it all together in this race and the other street circuits that he's won at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, like you mentioned at the end, just fending off Charles Leclerc, great job with doing that, because he was so close, and they enabled DRS at that point. There were so many times where I was like, oh, it's there. But in order to pass on this track, you've got to be right on their gearbox to do it. And you got to be so careful about how you do it, or you're going to end up in the barrier yourself.
Yeah.
So he really did a great job, and then was able to pull that gap out. Unfortunately, I think Charles he was on the slicks at that point when he was pushing super hard to try and fight Perez.
Yep.
He just wasn't after that. And he was able to pull that 2-second gap. That was it. I think Charles' tires just completely let out at that point, and he was just more focused on finishing the race, which is such a shame, because Sergio Perez did get a 5-second penalty after the race was over, almost 3 hours later. We found this out. And if Charles would have been just within 5 seconds of him, he could have won the race technically. I kept thinking about that after the race. I was like, if you just would have kept that gap, and he just didn't. I think there was a 7 seconds between them at the end.
It's a double-edged sword. And, I think you're right in saying that Charles kind of made a mistake of trying to attack too early. But I think we're not giving Checo enough credit for the fact that he was told on the radio, hey, you might be getting a penalty. And then he just walked away from arguably a faster car, right? We know that Checo's the tire whisperer, right? He's always known to take care of them. And I think he did a really good job of kind of not pushing the tires too hard. And once Charles dropped out of that DRS range and Checo knew, hey, I might be getting a penalty, he just walked away. And I was really surprised Charles didn't put up more of a fight, but maybe he really was just struggling. And every time they cut to him, you could see tail coming out.
Yeah.
It's tough, but I think more so we just have to respect the job that Checo put in to be able to, not only keep Charles at bay, but keep him 5 seconds or more behind just to guarantee that win. So good for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of people were a little confused / heated after the race. I also was a little confused when it came up that the FIA would investigate this after the race. And if you don't know what Perez was being investigated for 2 instances of safety car infringement. The rule is he needs to stay at least 10 car lengths behind the safety car at all times. He can't go any closer and can't be any further back than that. And apparently
they just can't go further.
Right. Yeah. And apparently they witnessed him break this rule at least twice during the race, and they said they would evaluate it after. And I'm kind of sitting there going, why? Like, if it's such a simple rule, as in,
isn't it black and white? Yeah, exactly.
Right. Why are we waiting? And in fact, it took them almost 3 hours after the race.
I don't understand it. And I heard Martin Brundle say that maybe they needed to get the driver, they needed to talk to him to see exactly, if maybe there was an impediment that he had to slow down or something like that. But at the end of the day, that to me seems like something, like you said, it's black and white, and it should be, okay, this happened, therefore this penalty. Like, it should be instantaneous.
Yeah, I agree. So then I was sitting there thinking, okay, well, I'm going to see the results of this race, but I'm going to still sit here going, well, this might not be the actual results. So this is fake.
I remember this happened to Carlos when he got his first podium.
Yes.
He found out about it like 2 hours after, and that's such a shame, because it was Carlos's first podium and he didn't get to celebrate. And like, that's the kind of stuff we need to get out of F1. Like you said, that seemed to be a ruling that should have just been simple, black and white, instantaneous. I'm not sure why we had to wait 3 hours after the race.
And this is just, I think, another case of where everyone starts to get frustrated with the FIA. Like, why? Why did that? It's a black and white rule.
Right.
Like, what else did you need to know?
Yeah.
So That's interesting. I think also a little frustrating as a fan
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
happen. And then you're sitting around after the race going, well, I just saw him win, but I'm still not sure if
Right.
he won.
Yeah. Red Bull's crossing their fingers 2 hours after the race to, hope they still have another 25 points. But
Yeah.
yeah, hopefully that's stuff that the FIA can learn from. And I think recently they've done a good job of learning from their mistakes. So hopefully they recognize, okay, this was way too long to get a judgment on this, and they'll
Yeah.
fix that.
Yeah. Let's hope so. Also, just like gold stars for Burt Mylander today, like gold stars. Like
He
how
should be
many
getting paid
times?
overtime. I'll tell you what.
Yeah. How many times was he out on that track in that Mercedes? What, at least four? I think it was three times.
3 or 4. Yeah, something like
Because we
that.
had some virtual safety cars and
Hmm.
we had some actual safety cars. And that's a lot. Like these guys can barely keep these F1 cars on the track. And then he has to
Hmm.
keep that car on the track while backing everybody up and not going too
Yeah.
slow. So
Well, I think this track actually, uh, I heard the commentators saying that there has not been a race at Singapore where the safety car wasn't deployed. That
yes.
just goes to show you how tough of a track it is. 20 of the best drivers in the world, and every single time they've raced there, somebody's crashed. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Right. Like
It is
that
crazy.
just goes to show you how tough it is on these guys.
It is. And like I think like we mentioned before, but the heat doesn't help.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
you're sitting in there trying to concentrate on one of the hardest technical tracks in the world to drive on, and you're also just sweating from every orifice of your
Exactly.
body.
Oh yeah, it's
Like you,
tough.
I don't know if you saw, but when Alonso got out of his car, he had to sit along the track, which I loved. He literally was just sitting there watching the race like a spectator, but you could see he was drenched. He
Oh
was
yeah.
completely soaked. And
Yep.
we see drivers ice bathing. We see them being sprayed with like all
Hmm.
these liquids to keep them cold, wearing physical ice packs. We saw George being like, what's it called? The dry ice like blowers they have, just
Yep.
pointing it directly at him. I was like, is that safe? We're gonna like freeze his limb off. But yeah, it's a crazy race. I would love to go see it one day. Before we end on talking about the race, I do want to say another team that had some great results, Aston Martin. And it was amazing to see Seb defending against Lewis and Max.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
loved every second of that.
It was a shame that he couldn't hold both of them off,
Oh,
but
I know.
he was defending phenomenally. Again, it's a tough track to overtake, but it was so cool to see three of the best drivers of an era, right? I mean,
Yeah.
well, I guess Max maybe is the next era, but like, yeah, the three guys who are world champion, phenomenal drivers battling it out. It was a shame it wasn't for positions 1, 2, and 3, but still, at the end of the day, we get to see three phenomenal drivers like that battle it out, and Lewis making that mistake and Max jumping on it. That was really exciting racing.
Yeah, it was great. I loved it. I feel like we got a bit of racing during this whole race, but because of all the safety cars and everything, it got a little crazy. But at the end there, we got some good battles, and I loved every second of that. And Seb, just great performance from Aston Martin as a whole. Again, another
Hmm.
decent weekend for them.
And
Let
I
me.
think we do need to bring up Lance Stroll finishing P6. Is that right?
I am looking right now. Oh, I'm looking at the
Yeah.
yes, Lance Stroll finished P6 and Sebastian Vettel finished P8. Great
Uh,
points.
Yeah, I think that this year Lance has done, especially recently, he's done a better. He's out qualified. He's outperformed Seb. I know a lot of people don't like him, and there's the pay driver, which he is. But at the end of the day, I do think he is a deep driver, and he's showing that he can drag that car into points because it isn't a great car. Um, but the fact that he finished sixth, and again, he was opportunistic, just like the McLarens were. But I was really impressed at the fact that he ended up holding off sixth place.
Yeah, I think so too. It just great things are coming from that team. Hopefully this is making Fernando Alonso feel a little bit better about
Hmm.
going to them.
Hmm.
I know that whole team and Lawrence Stroll have promised big things and big plans for that team. And they've had a slow progression over this year. They started off absolute garbage.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't say they're amazing right now, but they have shown improvement,
For
which is
sure.
good. Better than nothing for
Yep.
sure.
Improvement and lots of money, and that's exactly what they have. And I don't think they're going to be competing for wins.
Mhm.
Certainly not this year, and probably not next year. But you would hope that um, with enough development, enough money that Lawrence is putting into the team, we'll actually see another powerhouse team that can produce a winning car.
I hope so. I really do. Well, it was a good race. Even though it was long and we had the rain delay, I thought it was still interesting. I think the safety cars spiced everything up and kept my
Mhm.
attention because there were definitely times where I was like, I remember we made it to 30 laps and there was another safety car, and I was like, oh my God, we're
I
only
know.
halfway through.
Once we hit 30 laps, I was like, okay, we're gonna hit a time limit before we actually finish this race.
Yeah, and I watched it later in the day, because I was gonna get up and then I was so exhausted. I was like, "You know what? I'm gonna watch this later." And I'm glad I did, or else I would have been sitting around for a rain delay situation, and I would have been so mad. Also, I definitely would have been passed out. I would have never been awake for the race to begin with.
Yep. Yep.
All right, everyone. Now we are at the ending portion of our podcast, but I think a lot of people's favorites portion. We have meme of the week. Matt,
That's right.
bring it to us.
Well, meme lords,
Meme
meme
lords.
lords. I got a good one. And we kind of talked about it. You'll have to go to our Twitter page to take a look. But once Checo found out he had a penalty, he walked away. We said he really sped it up and was able to pull away. And somebody made a meme of Star Wars Lightspeed, and it says Perez after being told about a possible penalty, which I thought was a good one because man, did he take off. Ludicrous speed.
What do they call it in Star Wars? I should know this. I'm a huge Star Wars fan.
Warp speed.
Light speed.
Light
Light
speed, yeah.
speed. They go into
Yeah.
light speed. Yeah, it was literally like that when
Yeah.
because at first I was watching it and I was like, oh, Leclerc will definitely be able to keep within 5 seconds of him. And then all of a sudden I just saw the seconds ticking up and up and
Yep.
up. And I was like, what is going on?
At one point, I was just waiting for Charles to pass him because he was right on his gearbox. And then all of a sudden, Checo said, nope, see ya.
Yeah. So if you want to see that meme and share it with all of your F1 friends, you can go check our Twitter account at Mr. and Mrs. F1 Pod. Or I will also post it somewhere because this is a video now. I'll
That's
put it
right.
here on the screen so you can check that out. And I'll post it on our Instagram as well at Mr. and Mrs. F1 Pod. Now for admin of the week, my favorite portion of this whole podcast. You get to do memes. I get to do admins. I give an award for the best admin of the week every week, who I think has earned the fans' love and support. And this weekend, AlphaTauri just, wow. First of all, they've always been very good with serving us like Pierre and Yuki friendship love. I love that. You don't think those two would be friends because they're just such different people and personalities, but they're hilarious together. They posted this cute picture of both Yuki and Pierre in ice baths, like sitting across from each other in ice baths, which is phenomenal. And then they also posted a YouTube video where Pierre is feeding Yuki like food, but Yuki's blindfolded. And it's just the cutest, most wholesome friendship moment ever.
Bromance.
And yes, it's such a little bromance that I think no one expected. And AlphaTauri just with the content this week for Singapore and featuring these two lovely drivers of theirs, just gold star. You get an award, admin.
Give someone a raise.
Yeah, give someone a raise. AlphaTauri gets them the admin of the week award. So, well, that's all we have for you today for the podcast. Thank you all for sticking around. I know we haven't put out a show in 2-3 weeks just because of our lives craziness. It's been crazy over here at the Gable House.
Sure has.
Gable Houses. Do we have two now? Is that how this works?
Yeah.
But thank you guys for being patient with us, and thank you for being patient with us as we go forward. as we live in different states and move. And we're so excited to show you Boston when we're both there, and take you on this little journey with us. So thank you. As always, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, share it with all of your F1 friends, and make sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Also, you can find us on all social media at Mr. and Mrs. F1 Pod, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and this podcast that your ears are listening to now is a live video on our YouTube page. Amazing.
Right.
We're now going to have this now since we're recording on Zoom, since we're apart. So make sure to check it out, and you can put a face to the names that you hear on this show. So from Pennsylvania, thank you.
And from Boston, see you guys next week when we talk about Japan.
Yes. See you next week and in Japan. Bye-bye.